morning everyone, or good evening, depending on what time you are watching this video. Today we're going to be doing something very exciting, and it's been a very popular painting of mine. I hope you enjoy this. So this is the reference photo that we'll be using today. It is a boardwalk that my daughter and I actually walked on this. It's in a park in Ontario. Today our materials include the usual paint brushes. You can use palette knives as well. I use them for mixing up the paint. You can get yourself a palette. And these are the colors. These are the oil colors we'll be using. We have, from left to right, we have titanium white, we have raw umber, cadmium yellow and azo yellow, cadmium red, cobalt blue, Prussian blue, sap green, and I also use walnut oil to thin out the paint occasionally when I need to do that. Of course, as usual, the first thing we do is we grab ourselves either a charcoal pencil or whatever you have. If you also have just a regular lead pencil, that works too. And again, we're going to start off and we're going to take a look at our image. And we're going to check and see where we would like to have the horizon line. And if I use my imagination and I'm looking behind the trees where I feel the sky is meeting the ground, I'm going to say we're just about at this line here. So you can put in your, even though we're not actually going to paint the horizon line, you can put that in, and that just gives us a reference point. Try not to ever put your horizon line in the very center of your composition, or anything for that matter in the center of your composition. It's just, it's always a rule that when you put things a little bit off center, it always looks so much better in your composition. So I would say in this image here, our biggest, most important element is that boardwalk. So we're going to put that in. I'm going to set this up here. Now you can use a ruler if you prefer. I'm going to sketch it in lightly and then go back through with a ruler. And I would say this here is where the boardwalk kind of ends and I can't see it anymore. So I'm going to draw that first line and then the second line coming down towards me where I'm standing. And then this here, and the next line, and again, coming up to where I'm standing. And we're going to go in, and there is a tree line in the very background. Kind of disappears back here. And I'm just kind of roughly marking in where I think the tree tops end as they touch the sky. Because this is a forest scene, sometimes not everything is visible to us, so we kind of have to use our judgment. Over here I've got some nice little saplings coming through, so I'm just going to sketch in where I want those trunks. Another trick, I suppose you could say, that a lot of artists use when building their composition is to put things in threes. The number 3 just creates a lot more balance than having things in even numbers. Again, that's just something that's been discovered through the years. There's a little branch kind of arching over here. I'm going to draw it in. It doesn't mean we're actually going to use that, but I'm going to put it there. I always like to have something a little bit more in the foreground. Over here we've got a tree. I don't want to put it too, because this here is almost mid-center. I'm actually going to move it down a little bit. And we'll put that tree in here. And if you hear a little meowing in the background, that's just one of my little cats that I have. I have two. They're about 12 years old, and they're brothers. Okay, and we've got a tree over here. We'll put that all the way up. We've got another one here that's kind of leaning into it. Cut that through. And now there's some that are, again, kind of mid-ground, but I want to get something here in the foreground. So I'm going to put a final tree. It's obviously larger in the foreground. Now, as I've said before, if you've ever watched any of my workshops, the reference image is just that. It's something to refer to. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to it hard and fast and that you can't make changes. So, I mean, it's artist choice. You are the artist here and you are creating your masterpiece. And so it's up to you how you want to create this. So you can add things, you can omit things. It's completely your choice. I'm just kind of putting in, there's sort of like bushes here in the mid-ground. I'm just sort of sketching in loosely where I think those might be. And then there's sort of another line of bushes here and vegetation. Okay. Now I don't want too much detail in this because a lot of this, like I said, is going to get covered up. Mostly this is just a guide to help as we're painting. Now if you feel more comfortable using a ruler to draw the boardwalk boards, you can certainly use it. You can also freehand it. The thing is, when you go to paint, you're going to be doing freehand anyhow. And there's a lot of boards in here. I'm not going to use all of these boards because it tends to get much too busy in a painting. The more stuff you include like this, you want to simplify things for the viewer. You want to keep the lines fairly parallel to each other. Again, like I said, it's not perfect. Life isn't perfect. And as you get further and further away, these boards are going to be closer and closer together. Things that are further in the distance appear smaller. Things that are closer to you are larger, appear larger. The idea is here. I'm going to do the rest of these just kind of, because it's sort of much further back, and these lines are going to get fainter and fainter anyhow, lighter and lighter. There we go. Okay, so now we can start to paint. So if this is your first time doing a workshop and your first time painting, it might be a little bit challenging for you just because this is a pretty complex composition. I'm going to try and simplify it like I usually do as much as possible so that everyone is able to complete a composition that they're happy with. So what I'm doing right now is I'm taking a little bit of that azo yellow and I'm mixing it in with some titanium white, and I don't want it too thick on my brush because I want it thin enough that I can still paint over. This is oil paint I'm using. If you're using acrylic, this area is going to dry for you by the time you go back and do your trees. With oil paint, we have to be a little bit more strategic in how we do things. So like I said, I'm just doing it very thin, very light. Okay, so I've mixed in some of my walnut oil. It's super thin now, but that's fine. We will work with that. Add a little bit more. Now don't be afraid to cover up some of these trees that you've added in here. Because the trunks are still down below, you'll know where they are. And same with the tree line. I want you to cover some of that as well, because we want the sky to show through in the background as we go. We don't want to have a solid line where the treetops end and the sky begins. We want to try and keep things fairly natural looking. It's always important to put that through. Now, as always, I encourage you, if you've been painting for a while and you feel pretty confident that you can kind of go on your own with palette choices and colors and things. If you don't want your sky to be the color that we're using today, then feel free to go ahead and mix whatever color it is that you prefer. If you want this to be a nice soft blue instead of a yellow, you can definitely do that. If you look carefully at your reference image, the sky does appear as a soft yellow. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the leaves are reflecting the sunlight, the soft sunlight. This is an early morning. And the sky is giving off that yellowish hue. And it's only to the viewer. It's not going to be people looking up in the sky further away in the distance or further away from where we're walking here. They don't see this. It's only those of us that are walking this trail right now. That's the really neat thing about painting in general and creating artwork, is that we're capturing a moment in time. We're capturing an experience. Something that only we saw with our own eyes. Okay, so pretty happy with that. Let me bring it down a little bit more in here. I haven't decided how far up or down we're going to put our trees. It's always easier to put the sky in first, I find. Some people do the negative painting, and I will be doing workshops to show negative painting where you do the foreground first and work your way towards the background. It's a little bit more difficult. Right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put in, if you look carefully on your image, there is a soft kind of transition between the sky and the treetops. So we're going to put that in, and we've already got sort of a soft yellow happening. We're going to take some of that, move it off to the side, and we're going to add in a tiny little bit of our cobalt blue, because blue and yellow will give you green. And we want to keep it soft and light. So we're going to add some white to it. And we'll put that in. where those background trees are. Basically what we're doing at this point is we're blocking in. This is what artists call the blocking in period, or the blocking in process. We're just putting in blocks of color, covering the canvas. I have been looking at, I know I've been having trouble with audio on some of these videos that I've been doing for you, and I've been looking at various microphones that I can get. Of course, the one that I really want is a little bit over my budget right now. It's about $300. But I'm certainly going to be investing in that as soon as I can. That'll make a huge difference, especially when I start doing more plein air workshops, which are outdoors. It will help eliminate some of that outdoor noise that you get, traffic noise and wind noise and things like that. Don't worry if you go over top of some of the lines that you've drawn. Like I said, you know where it is and you know where it is supposed to go. So we drew them in because we wanted to kind of use muscle memory and go, okay, this is where this is where that is. So then when we get to that point in our painting, we already know. I'm not using any particular brush stroke at this point. When we're doing the blocking in, it's fairly informal. Just kind of laying down color at this point. I don't want the line to be too straight across, so I'm going to vary it a little bit. Yes, what can I do for you, my little kitten? I have some very demanding little kittens here. Put more of this here on this side because our light is actually coming across. If you look at your image, the light is up above and it's sort of like hitting in here and hitting along these trees. So it's kind of in front of us. So I want this forward bit to be the lightest, and then it'll get darker as it comes towards us. Okay, let's switch over now. Our next little block that kind of goes in here has a touch of gold and orange. So we'll grab ourselves another brush. When you're doing oil paint, you tend to use a bunch of different brushes. And I know I didn't mention earlier in this video, but try and use, when you're doing the blocking in, a larger brush. If you're using a smaller brush, like something like this, it's going to take you forever to get done. If you look at that, how much slower it's going to be to cover that area, use a larger brush. If you have something even larger that you're comfortable with, then go ahead. If you're totally okay with using that, that'll get the job done even faster. So now we're going to do a little bit of orangey gold. So I'm taking a little bit of my cad red, take some of my yellow, and I actually might use some cad yellow with that. And it's going to be more of a gold orange rather than like a pumpkin orange, more of a like a squash, I suppose. But I'll grab some of my white mute that down. So we've got kind of a gold orange going on, which is absolutely perfect, what I'm looking for. Then we'll grab that with our fresh brush. And again, we're going to put it through here very thin. Kind of blocking that area in. You can see how I'm kind of overlapping the areas. It's totally what I want you to do. Overlap that area. This gold, you can bring it down as far as you want. I kind of see little bits of gold here in the foreground as well. So I'm going to block that in down here. Goes up there. Coming through here. And then on the other side, there's also a touch of that gold over here as well, if you look at your image. We've almost lost the tree trunks now on this right-hand side, but like I said, that's fine. Don't fret. That's what the reference image is for. We'll be able to go back in and find that again. Bits here. So we've got a darker color, which is actually the ground. The reason I'm sure most of you are aware that they put boardwalks like this through a forest is because the ground below is too soft and mushy, usually like a bog or a marsh. And if you ever look closely at that particular dirt that's under there, it's usually like a really deep brown, almost got a reddish tinge to it. So we're going to put that in these areas, and then we'll be able to put our green vegetation over top. So again, I'm going to grab another brush, and oftentimes I'll use the same brush, but because we've got so many different little blocks of color in here, I'm going to want to keep those brushes because I'm probably going to use those brushes again and go back in and add more of that particular color in there. So let's grab another brush. Grab this one here. Again, it's a very similar size. I have some raw umber. That I'm going to use. And I'm going to grab some of my cat red and mix that into the raw umber. So it gives me a very reddish brown. It's fairly dark. Take my brush and again grab some of that. And I don't know if you've also noticed when I'm painting, I try to keep the paint on the end of the brush. To me that just makes more sense because I'm not actually painting with like this part of the bristles will probably never or hardly ever touch the canvas. So I want my paint to be loaded on the tips of my brushes. So let's put in some of that. Brown dirt that we see. In here. Over here. Again, if you look at your reference image, the left side of the image is quite dark, so a lot of it is in shadow. Simply because of where the sun is and the fact that the trees do cover up a lot of the light and provide some pretty deep shade in those areas. Do this fairly thin back here, simply because there's going to be some green vegetation that covers that. I don't want to do it too thick. And then here on the other side. On the other side, I'm actually going to take some of that darker color that we've just been using, and I'm going to add a small dot of white into it, because again, like I said, on this other side here, there's a little bit more light coming through. So while the dirt is still dirt, it does appear a little bit lighter, because we've got more light coming into this area. I hope that you are having fun when you're doing these workshops with me. Oftentimes I'm doing things that I've done before, but as any artist can tell you, we never do anything exactly the same twice in a row. So for me to completely duplicate that original painting that I've done, pretty much impossible. My head's in a different place today than where it was when I created that first piece. So the results are going to be different. So this makes it exciting for me too when I'm doing this with you, because I don't really know how this is going to end up either. So we're on a journey together. It's pretty exciting. Okay, we've got that basic in, and then we're going to grab one more, and we're going to kind of take a, no, I've got this one here. Take this one, and we're going to go back in and we're going to do some green. And I'm actually going to use some of that sap green, which I don't normally use, but in this case, because we have so much green going on in here, I'm actually going to use what I call a base green, which is a sap green, but I never use just the sap green pure out of the tube. I'm going to add some azo yellow to it, because I want to get over here, if you look at your image, I want to get that kind of this very brilliant green that's happening over there. So add the azo yellow. And that gives me exactly what I'm looking for. And I can vary it. I can add more yellow, I can add more green. Again, we're doing a very impressionistic sort of look with this piece. I think they're more fun than doing hyperrealism, although some people really like the hyperrealism, and that's awesome. I used to be very much into that kind of thing when I was younger. Now I actually prefer a little bit more of an impressionistic feel to the artwork. So as you can see, I started off fairly light here. I'm getting a little bit darker as we get closer here, because this green, if you look at your image and even just using common sense, it's closer to you, and so it's going to be a little bit darker. So we're going to add more green and less yellow. But like I said, don't use just your solid sap green. Always mix. I never use any colors straight out of the tube. I'm always mixing. Tube colors are nice, but I don't think they're actually terribly true to life. I always treat them as a base color that I use, and then I achieve the shades and tones that I want, adding in other colors. Okay, so now on the other side we've got green as well in the mid to foreground. And we'll start here on the outer edge, which is lighter. Grab a little more yellow. There we go. And then as we get back deeper into the forest here, the green gets a little darker, almost an emeraldy sort of green. And I haven't added any blue yet. We might as we go along. We'll have to take a look, see where we're at when we get to that point. Just dotted a little bit over top of my brown here. Some in here as well. So what I want to do next is get some of these tree trunks in. So this time we will take a smaller brush. I don't want to go too small. Depends on the size of the trunk. I think for the bigger one I'm going to use this brush here. And I'm going to start with my burnt umber. I'm going to add in a little bit of yellow, a little bit of white, if you look at your image, the trunks are darker on the left side where the shadow is. And the right side is lighter where the sunlight is. Just roughly putting in that tree trunk. I'm going to switch out my brush as I get to the thinner area. Switch to a smaller brush. Always good rule of thumb is to match your brush to the area that you're painting. So obviously if it's a smaller area, you want to grab a smaller brush. It takes away the frustrations that you might be experiencing if you're trying to use a larger brush in a small area, or a small brush in a large area. That can sometimes be problematic too. And you can see I just mixed a lighter color for this side of the trunk, where the light is. Coming up here, go all the way up, and it's okay if you go over top of your sky in your background. It's perfectly fine. Well, I've got this color on my brush. I'm going to put this one in too. Put it up a little further. Now, of course, because this is a pre-recorded workshop, if you find that I'm working too far ahead for you, or you didn't quite understand something that was said, you can stop the video and go back and check out what you might have missed, or re-listen to something, or pause and go have a snack. One of the awesome benefits of having a pre-recorded instructional video. I like those actually. They look pretty cool. Let's do some, I'm going to switch now to, let's do the darker area first, and then we'll switch the brush. Do the back darker area of these trees that we just did. Finish this one off, going all the way up. The only disadvantage of these videos is, as opposed to you being here in my studio, is I can't see you and how you're holding your brush, how the paint is being applied. But I do use, when I do this, I use a very light touch. It's the nice thing about oil paint, because it's so fluid and so soft, especially if you're using the walnut based paints that I'm using, that you really don't need to put a lot of pressure between the brush and the canvas to get the paint to stick. Very different experience. This tree's a little further back, so even though I'm adding the shadow, I don't want it to be as dark, because I want it to have the illusion of things going off into the distance. So I'm going to switch over to one of my favorite brushes. This is It's a flat top brush. This happens to be a number 6. It's a Curry's brand. And I like these because I can draw nice fine edges with those flat edges. So we're going to do our trees on the other side. And I'm going to add more yellow, more white to my tree trunk mixture here. And we did cover up these trees, so I'm going to put in a tree. One here. One here. This one's going to go over top of our boardwalk, which we haven't put in yet. I will put that over top of the boardwalk when we've got to that point. I'm going to add a little bit of dark to the trunk. Kind of like that. It's always good to stop and pause and take a look at what you're doing periodically through the process. So you can always make changes as you go. So the next step we're going to attack is our boardwalk. And like we talked about before, there's a lot of slats in here, and I'm not going to put all of those in. And there's a few different ways I can do this. I can actually paint each slat as we go and add back in the lines in between each slat, or I can paint this whole thing and then add the lines in. And I think for the purposes of doing this, I'm going to do, I know which way I did it last time, and I'm going to do it different this time. Last time I did each slat individually. This time I'm going to do the whole thing, and we'll see how that works out. So here we've got sort of a gray, kind of a warmish gray color. So I'm going to grab some of my white and put it off to the side on my palette here. And we're going to take some of our raw umber. When you mix raw umber with white, you actually get a warm gray, and you can vary the color, the darkness or the lightness of it by adding obviously more of the brown in there. So I've got sort of a mid-ground color. I wanted to make it a little bit cooler, so I'm going to take some of my cobalt blue and just a tiny little bit, and I'm going to add that in to the warm gray that we created. And you can see how that's cooled it down and turned it a little more silver. And I'm going to grab a decent sized brush actually, because that's a pretty big area. And I'm just going to go in, and it looks like, if you look at your image, there's like little dark splotches and white splotches, and because the wood is variable. The wood grain varies from area to area. So I'm not going to brush this in as a solid area. Keep it fairly random. You don't want to put an exact pattern in here. It's okay, your edges, you're going to end up grabbing some of that paint that you've already put down and pulling it across, which is fine. If you're using acrylic, chances are that area, if it's not dry, it's semi-dry, so you probably won't be pulling it across as much. So like I said, I called this the medium gray. The medium gray, as we get further in the back, is actually the darkest gray back here. Because as we said, things further away are lighter and blurrier and smaller. And yes, I know what you're thinking right now. You're saying, hey, but we're covering up all those lines. Yeah, we are, but that's all right. Again, we can put those back in. Now I'm going to, before I grab the dark, I'm going to grab a little more of the white and take some of that gray we just did and make it even lighter. So it's almost white, but not really. And we're going to put in where the lighter areas are, or where we want them to be. Now if you notice with this, I'm actually using a fairly horizontal stroke across. It's just a tendency of mine to try to simulate what it is that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at grain of wood that does go sort of horizontally from left to right or right to left. So I'm just kind of simulating that with a brush stroke. It's just a method of painting that I've always used. I don't know if someone has ever said to me that that's what I'm supposed to do, or if it's just something that in my own head I've said that this is the way I want to do this. Either way, it works well for me, so if you want to give it a try, by all means, give it a try. And like I said earlier, up here it's going to get much, much lighter. Go in with the medium gray that I have left, and I'm going to add more of the brown into it to darken it for our dark areas. I'm going to add a tiny little bit more of our blue, our cobalt blue, and then we'll go in and we'll add the dark area. You can see now how as I'm doing this, I'm really utilizing that brush stroke, the horizontal brush stroke. Again, it's just a technique I developed to simulate the wood grain. I think it's just many, many hours spent observing trees and observing that kind of thing in life. It's something that's always fascinated me. To me, the grain of a tree, the wood grain, the bark, is like, it's individual. Every tree just seems to have its own pattern and it's very individual. Like fingerprints, I guess. So we're continuing through adding our darker areas. And I don't remember if I mentioned at the beginning, the size of the board that I'm using today is it's a 12 by 9. And today I'm actually using a canvas board. I've got several different materials just kind of here in the studio. Usually when I purchase canvas, I don't purchase them one at a time. I'll go out and I'll buy different sizes, different kinds. Not with any particular plans in mind. I'll just purchase them and have them here, so that when I do want to use something in particular, I can take a look what I've got, and that's what I use. Kind of going back in and blending down a little bit of the detail, especially when it's further away. You don't want too much detail to show because it's going to make it appear that this part up here is closer to you than what it really is. So I want to kind of blend that in. I'm going to grab another brush to do a little more blending. This one here is smaller, but as you can see, the end of it is all splayed, but it's quite soft. So it works super well when I want to do some soft blending. So I've gone ahead and I've added in the branches to our trees. The brush that I like to use is this one here. This is the flat brush that we talked about earlier. The reason why I like to use it is if you can see that edge, that nice sharp edge, I find much easier to work with than, say, using a brush like this. The brush like this, you're working with a tiny little point. And I find that, me personally, I find that much more difficult to manage than using a brush with that edge. And basically, when I'm using this, I have more control, I find, than I would if I was using that other tiny brush. this one. I have much better control with creating these tree branches. Back here, I added a branch from our foreground tree pointing down towards where we want the viewers to go into our composition. And when I did these tree branches, I started with the trees that are furthest away and did those branches and then worked my way forwards. So then naturally as I go, the branches that are closer can overlap the ones that are farther away, and I don't have to worry about all that sort of thing. Okay, so what we're going to do, next step, we'll add in, no, you know what, I'm going to go back to the boardwalk. There's an area here that I find I want to blend in a little bit more. I'm going to grab a fresh brush, nice dry brush with a soft splayed edge. And if you look carefully at your image, you'll see that some of those leaves are actually reflecting on the boardwalk, giving it a bit of a yellowy look in this area here, and I like that, so I'm actually going to use that in my composition. And in order to do that, I just basically need to soften that edge and pull across some of that yellow into the boardwalk. Just like that. Just that very slight little bit. And what that did automatically, well, the boardwalk looked like it was kind of floating way up above everything. What that did is it actually grounded the boardwalk now. And I'm going to do the same thing on this edge over here. If you look again at your image, you've got almost the green of that area, again, is being reflected onto the boardwalk. So I'm going to pull that in to that boardwalk. And I still have some of that green on my palette. I'm going to actually go back in and grab some of that. And again, that flattened our boardwalk. So while I've got this blending brush, I'm going to blend a little bit of these foliage that we put in, the edges, especially this one that's further away. Just want to soften that. And on this side too. We're going to go back in and add more detail, but I'm going to soften this a little bit first. The other thing I want to do on this side, take another flat brush that's dry. I'm going to grab some of the dirt, pull it in. To our boardwalk. just in a few spots. Grab some of that color. Now that we're in the foreground here, we can define it a little bit more. We've got more. You can see that detail a little better because it's up close to us. Brush off because over here this is actually this color that's going to get pulled in. I do have that on my palette as well. Grab some of that. There we go. Now our boardwalk isn't floating anymore. So we're going to start adding in some leaves. The first leaves I want to add are the bright yellow ones that you see way back in the background. Mixing up some yellow. It's fairly similar to that color, but slightly lighter. I'm just going to dot in some of those leaves. And the reason I'm doing this technique is because these leaves are far away. We know they're leaves because our brain tells us they're leaves because we've experienced leaves before and we've seen them from a distance before. And we also know that because they're so far away, they just look like blobs to our eye. So we're not going to go in there with a tiny little brush and do every individual leaf because we don't need to. Because our brain already knows what this is. So we've got some there, got some back here. And I'm not covering up the foreground trees with this part because this is the yellow leaves that I see back in behind the trees that are in those trees further back. So a little bit over here. Whenever you're using a color, you don't want to use it just in one place in your composition. You want to use it in a few different places. It helps the eye to move around, and then it doesn't create this thing that your eye fixates on because it sticks out from everything else. Okay, so we've got that. I'm going to put in, there's some slightly darker green than the green we put in the background. I'm going to put that in, those leaves there. So basically I'm using the same brush. I'm just now adding a bit of green to what was already on my brush. Might have to be a little darker, yep, in order for it to be visible. Keep in mind if you're using oil, Because we're doing this all in one sitting, the oil is wet on your canvas, and as you're adding more paint on top of paint, the paint that you're adding is mixing with the paint below. So it's going to affect the color. So at this stage, if you want something darker, it's better to mix it darker than what you want, especially if you're putting it over something lighter. And then when you put it on your canvas, it'll be closer to the color that you actually are looking for. So again, because these are in the background, I'm going in between the branches. Some of this green is kind of dotted in. Our gold orange area as well. A little bit more over here. Now, as you're watching me do this, you can see that I'm not covering up that lighter green that's in behind. I don't want to cover it up. I want that to come through, because adding the layers and the layers and the layers, that's what gives depth to your composition. You don't want to cover it up entirely. You want to keep it light and airy, and it will give the illusion of a forest. Lots of layers of trees. I think I'm pretty happy with the background foliage. Let's grab Magic Tree Brush. I know I've talked about this before. They're basically a fan brush, but to me they're a magic tree brush. I've got 3 different ones here. This one here is the oldest. I've had this since I was in high school. This one I bought not too long ago, and this one is the most recent addition. And they're all different. They're all different size. This one is lighter and has smaller bristles, so you can do like very, very lightly. These ones are a little bit thicker. I'm going to start off, I don't think it really matters that much. I'm going to start off with this one, because the bristles on the end are a little bit more open. It's an older brush. These brushes are great. You can use them for lots of different things. My favorite thing to use them for is for making trees and putting leaves on trees. So I'm going to grab a palette knife so I can do some color mixing. We're going to mix that green that you see in your image that's right about here. It's kind of the mid-tone green of those foreground trees. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the sap green, move it off to the side. It does have a yellow tinge to it, so we're going to grab some yellow. Mix that in, see what that looks like. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to add a little bit of white just because I'd rather go too light than too dark. Excuse me. It's always easier to make things darker than it is to make things lighter when your paint is wet. So I'm just loading up my brush on the ends again. And I'm just going to go in where the branches are, where I want these leaves. Which will be back here. And I'm just going to dot it in. very carefully. If you ever looked at trees, you'll see that at the ends of the branch, the leaves tend to be a little heavier, and as it gets in closer to the main trunk, they're a little bit lighter. This brush is giving me a hard time today. There we go. I'm just going to add in, and as I'm going, I'm varying the color, the shade of green that I'm using, because if you look carefully again at your reference image, there's a lot of different shades of green in there, simply because the leaves are all at different stages of changing color. And again, I don't want to fill this in. I want to keep it light and airy. I want the sky to show through. And I want to be able to see some of those lovely branches that we put in here as well. So I don't want to cover those completely. This branch here that's pointing down the pathway, I'm actually not going to put any leaves on it, because otherwise you would probably cover up that directional line, and we want to keep that line. This far side, I'm going to use a darker green. So what I'm going to do is add some blue to my sap green. So we've got some darker leaves and branches that are actually coming from off our image here. We can't really see where they're coming from, but they are going across. And I like the contrast of this dark green with the orange peeking through and behind. So I want to put that in. Coming down here too. Bit over here. Like I said, you want to have that color in various places. You don't want to have it just in one area. Down here also. Also good for foliage using this brush. See? You don't want to overdo it. You have to stop occasionally. Take a look, step back. So I'm going to grab this smaller fan brush. And we've got on this side here, we've got some brighter yellow leaves coming in and some kind of orangish, reddish leaves coming in over here. So put that in. go here. Red, orangey red here. New color I'm used to. I'm also going to use this color for a couple leaves. On our boardwalk. Again, we know they're leaves. It's not really necessary for me to grab the tiniest brush I have and torture myself drawing an actual leaf. Stand back and take a look. So the last thing you're going to be doing is taking a look to see where you can add a little bit more light, a little bit more shadow. I've added a little bit more light over here, just on the top, some of this foliage. A little bit over here as well. Some back here. And I want to make sure there's some nice dynamic contrast going on, so that our composition is exciting. A little bit more dark in the shadows. Now, to be honest, I could play with this probably for another hour. But sometimes you have to get to a point where you go, yeah, it looks great. So I think we're done. I'm going to grab that small brush that I had earlier, and we'll pick up one of the colors that we've been using. And your very last step is to sign your painting. I'm going to sign it down here. Sign it on the boardwalk. Make it look like somebody scratched in their name into the boardwalk. I'm not going to put it all the way to the bottom, because if this gets framed, it's going to get covered up. So put it kind of part way through. There we go. So I hope you enjoyed the class today. We've got a really nice peaceful boardwalk that we can display in our home or give as a gift. I hope you learned something, and I hope you had a very relaxing time. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.